Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, April 25th, 2024, and today we're going to be talking about the Pennsylvania Republican primary that took place just 2 days ago. And I know what you're thinking. We have not talked about the Republican primary in quite some time, and so you might be wondering as well, why are we talking about it today? And so the reason for that is because Pennsylvania had their primary 2 days ago, in which Nikki Haley, as a candidate who has long dropped out of the race since Super Tuesday, she removed herself from being in contention for the GOP nomination here, received 17% of the vote, what we call to be the zombie vote in the Republican primary here, taking 150 plus thousand votes in a closed Republican primary. Now, this showing in a state that Donald Trump desperately needs to win the 2024 presidential election doesn't come as good news. Nikki Haley receiving over 150,000 votes again in a closed Republican primary indicates that even amongst members of his own political party, there exists a level of discontent that drives voters out to the ballot box to vote for someone who isn't even on the ballot in practically, real sense. Nikki Haley is only here because she qualified and registered well out in advance, but hasn't been campaigning, hasn't been a major figure in the Republican Party side here, and has been long out of this race, enough that voters absolutely know that. And so when Nikki Haley comes in and receives this considerable portion of the vote here in direct contrast with how it was back in 2020 when Donald Trump was again on the ballot here, the zombie vote is quite interesting because it tells us that Donald Trump is receiving roughly 80 to 85% of the vote in consistent primaries here, but you cannot ignore the amount of Republicans who aren't, in fact, voting for him. For instance, in Connecticut, when this primary took place around April 10th, April 12th here, Donald Trump received 78% of the vote. Over 1 in 5 Republican primary voters had voted against Donald Trump being the Republican nominee for president. In the state of New York, a very similar thing happened here. 18% of the vote went to other candidates, and Nikki Haley herself received 13% in Donald Trump's former home state, a state that he did phenomenally in back in the 2016 election. And this zombie vote not existing back in 2020 shows that there absolutely is an increased amount of Republican disdain with President Trump being back on the ballot in 2024. These results here certainly are not good ones because it shows that there is absolutely a section of the party that is unwilling to back Donald Trump even when he is the only standing contender for the GOP nomination. Now, Pennsylvania, of course, comes at a unique point of interest because Joe Biden won this state back in the 2020 presidential election, but Donald Trump won it in the 2016 presidential election. It's a state that went back and forth between Trump and Biden and now is up for grabs again as one of the closest states of this election cycle in which President Biden maintains a lead of 0.4% across the state. It is so exceptionally close and was very close back in both 2016 and in 2020 and has been on the target list for Republicans across the country, both when it comes down to the presidential and congressional races, whether that be Senate or House elections that are very important in Pennsylvania. The state legislative races are also quite important. Democrats have a 1-seat advantage in both chambers here. And so Pennsylvania, again, at a unique intersection of a competitive state on every single level here. A lot of eyes will be on Pennsylvania this coming fall. But my point here is to say that given where it was back in 2020, Donald Trump really needs to make up this margin here. And while the polls might suggest that the state is being decided by a smaller margin than it was in 2020, ultimately Biden still pulls out ahead despite losing in a number of other battleground states. Now, Donald Trump lost this state to Joe Biden by roughly 70,000 votes across the state, 80,000 votes, which means that Nikki Haley receiving over 150,000 is absolutely insanity. It means here that the voters, again, closed primary matters. I didn't mention why it was important in the beginning, but a closed primary matters here because it is only registered Republicans that can vote on this election, which means that many of the voters here, and I think a lot of the Republican talking points have long been that Democrats are moving here to, vote in the Republican primary. They're pulling a Republican ballot, or they're independents who lean left that are pulling a Republican ballot. This is a closed primary state. And so people would have had to pre-register because the registration deadline is not same day in the state of Pennsylvania, had to pre-register and choose to vote as a Republican and be a registered Republican. So the barrier for entry here for Democrats voting in this primary is quite significant, and there isn't really much of a call for Democrats to switch over in terms of party registration to vote for the GOP candidates. I mean, what you're finding here Donald Trump has already won the nomination based on delegate count, so if anything, this is just Republican protest votes. And the Biden campaign is already jumping on this, because the Biden campaign recognizes that there are voters out there on the Republican side that voted against Donald Trump in 2016 in the primary, held their nose to vote for him in the general because they couldn't fathom the idea that Hillary Clinton would be president again, because he was the incumbent, held their nose and voted for him again in 2020 to continue a Republican presidency. But now in 2024, when we're presented with options like Governor DeSantis or Ambassador Haley or Senator Scott or Governor Christie or whoever it might be, they voted for those people and not President Trump. Because after January 6th, and after the 2020 election denialism, and after everything that Donald Trump pretty much perpetuated following the 2020 election, there were many Republicans out there that were looking for a clear-cut alternative. And to them, that included voting for Joe Biden in the event that Donald Trump was again the Republican nominee for president. And the fact that these voters are out there, very angry with Donald Trump, enough so that over a month after he has won the nomination are willing to get to the ballot box, vote for Nikki Haley as a protest vote against Donald Trump, you start to see that those voters are the ones that the Biden campaign can absolutely peel away from. Because those voters are the ones that are looking at it from a very different perspective than the base that was already voting for the GOP and already voting for Donald Trump. A lot of those voters are under this brand of country over party, that they're willing to vote for Joe Biden if it means it stops Donald Trump's ideology from being mainstream in the GOP for yet again. I think many of these voters here are jaded that they were willing to vote for Trump in 2016 because they saw again Hillary Clinton as this threat, didn't want a Democratic presidency in 2020, believed Donald Trump should be president again, but then were completely pushed out against him. And I think many of them felt comfort that the national polls and the national GOP seemed to have turned their backs on Donald Trump after the 2022 midterm elections, after Donald Trump's endorsed candidates, handpicked ones at that, lost in a number of key and crucial battleground states. But ultimately, that didn't matter, because push came to shove, and voters found themselves voting again for Donald Trump because the mainstream candidates here didn't pick up any mainstream funding besides Ron DeSantis, didn't really have the institutional backing that maybe they could have, that would have allowed them the opportunity to actually take on Donald Trump. Everything was working in favor of the former president, and ultimately, he became the victor. And so clearly there are voters out there, not only in Pennsylvania, but in Connecticut and New York and many other states where Donald Trump isn't getting more, in some cases, than 80 to 85% of the vote as the incumbent here, essentially. He's won the nomination. He's got a considerable portion of the vote. And I'm not here to say that this is at all, the immediate indicator that Donald Trump is going to lose the election. And I don't think that can be a takeaway strictly on primary voting results. But what I do think is that they tell us a story. A very different story than what we have been sold on by mainstream press as well. I think what we have come to understand on the Democratic side, when Joe Biden, for instance, received 88% of the vote in the Pennsylvania Democratic primary, 5% more than Donald Trump, a lot of the news and conversation around this, besides people who looked at it from an analytical lens, the headlines here were that the abandoned Biden movement was working in states like Pennsylvania, that Joe Biden was sub 90%, that there were voters out there that were unwilling to support the incumbent president. And that while may have been the case for some of them, a lot of the headlines we've been seeing in states like Minnesota, where you will find that Joe Biden will receive roughly the same percentage that somebody like Donald Trump will. And yet all the news articles are about the uncommitted vote, about the vote unwilling to vote for President Biden. And while it absolutely is true that those voters are necessary for Biden to win re-election, you're starting to see a duality of coverage here. Coverage that almost always skews in the negative on President Biden, that essentially takes some things that Donald Trump is seeing very much so on the Republican side, ignoring that reality and covering it from the Democratic lens. And the problem lies in the fact that Donald Trump has actually been performing worse in the Republican primary, despite no concerted effort on the Republican side to vote uncommitted, no concerted effort to vote for Nikki Haley as a zombie vote here. I mean, all of this has been really on the Democratic side, and yet Donald Trump himself has been performing worse than Joe Biden, despite there being, yes, a concerted effort on the left to, quote, abandon Biden. Yes, a concerted effort on the left to vote uncommitted, to vote for Dean Phillips, to vote for Marianne Williamson. I mean, a lot of these things that on the Democratic side, you're seeing so much coverage on, this is a story too. And this is a story that genuinely is going to make more of an impact. Because regardless of how you feel about this, the polls show that a significant number of Nikki Haley voters are voting for Biden in the general election. There is a reason why a Democratic campaign is here to court Republican voters like the Nikki Haley supporters in the Pennsylvania GOP primary. And let's not forget, Pennsylvania is a state that matters nearly above all. It's 19 electoral votes that could make or break the electoral map for Donald Trump. Because right now what we're looking at is a map very similar to the 2020 presidential. What we can do here is characterize all the states that Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden won in the last election. That includes Nevada, includes Illinois, and pretty much brings us here to 231 electoral votes. And if Pennsylvania is going blue, that leaves an opportunity here for Democrats to win with just Wisconsin and Michigan. Forget North Carolina, Ohio, Iowa, Texas, Georgia, Florida, Nebraska second, Maine second, Arizona. These states could all go to the Republican Party and Democrats would still pull ahead. And let's say, for instance, with Pennsylvania going, the most recent Bloomberg Morning Consult polls here show Biden up in Michigan by 2 points. Let's say Biden's able to hold on to Nebraska second. He's very much expected to. Let's say Trump wins a state like Nevada. That leaves us here with Democrats still winning. My point here is that Pennsylvania has also voted in unison with Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania since 1992. The last time it didn't was in 1988. And I don't imagine that this upcoming election will be the first. These states in midterm and presidential elections almost always vote together on the down ballot races, and of course, in presidential years, on the presidential races. And to see these states come back to Joe Biden in 2020, I could very well see them staying in 2024, especially when Joe Biden won the state by roughly 80,000 votes in the last election. That Donald Trump right now, or 70,000 votes actually, not 80,000, 70,000 votes across the state here. Actually, no, I'm right about this, 80,000. I don't know why I keep incorrectly calculating here. Regardless, though, Nikki Haley received 150,000 votes. And if it's anything like what we've seen in states like Iowa and New Hampshire, where 40 to 50% of Nikki Haley voters are voting for Biden in the general election, and this is a close primary. This is not amongst Democrats. This is not amongst independents. This is a Republican primary here. That's bad news for Donald Trump because he needs every single vote to win this election, and I don't know genuinely if he is going to get it. Because as much as he is outperforming in the polls compared to 2020 or compared to 2016, something is seriously off about this election. Something that makes me very skeptical of a lot of the data that we are seeing that suggests that Joe Biden's going to lose a state like North Carolina by 10 points. Because newsflash, he's not going to lose the state by 10 points. That was never really in the realm of possibility, and yet we entertain it more than we entertain real news stories like this one that showed Donald Trump at just 83% in one of the most crucial and key battleground states. The last thing I will leave you with is taking a look at our county map leads here, where we can see that Donald Trump in some parts of the state is at 90%, 81%, 90%, 89%, 86%, 88%, 90%, 89%, 84%. But in areas where it really matters, for instance, outside Philadelphia, 77%, 75%, 75%, 81%. Lower numbers than what it should be. And then the surrounding rural areas, it jumps back up. You look here, Erie County, 80%. Crawford County, 85%, getting better, right? You look at the middle of the state. Very good numbers for the former president, but in some of the areas where we have seen a consistent lack of improvement on. Even from 2016 to 2020, look at the surrounding areas. Some of the rural areas shifted right. Elk County, Clarion County, Indiana County, Armstrong County. But in some of these more suburban areas, for instance, right out here, Chester County, 8 points more Democratic. Montgomery County, 5 points more Democratic, and these have hundreds of thousands of voters. While Donald Trump may be doing well in some of the counties with 15,000 votes or 20,000 votes across the county, Joe Biden has seen improvements from 2016 to 2020 in the counties where you are seeing Donald Trump perform the worst when it comes down to the GOP primary. And so it's, again, those counties that do really well for Nikki Haley that when push comes to shove, I don't know if they're going to be voting for Trump in the general election. Because some of the data that we're seeing seems to suggest that maybe they won't be. And so when I see things like that, I take a step back and I look at our GOP primary results. I take a look at our GOP primary expectations here for Donald Trump and see that it isn't just Pennsylvania. It's a lot of other states too that have been spelling out these consistent warning signs for the former president. Things that should indicate a red flag that maybe this election isn't going to go as favorable to the GOP as some of their internal data might suggest, or even as some of the public data that we work with today. Donald Trump's Pennsylvania victory was a victory, but it certainly had way more of a protest vote than he should have been able to expect. Pennsylvania in 2020 was a very different story, and the Biden campaign is already jumping on this opportunity at targeting down these voters who chose Nikki Haley and trying to convince them to vote blue this coming November. The question on how effective that this is was yet to be seen, and we will find out November 5th, 2024. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.